let's jump into it. So this is episode 33 of Figure It Out, and we have a very special guest with us, nuclear physicist Wayne Norris. How you doing, sir?
For reals, right out the big.
Yeah. So tell us a little about yourself. What has your journey been like up to now? What's your newest project you're working on?
Thank you. I started as a young physicist working on moon rocks, 1969. Graduated from college 2 weeks before we landed a man on the moon. And I was a physicist at Rockwell Science Center in Thousand Oaks. We got rocks from Apollos 11 and 12. First thing that happened after Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon was they got down and took a shovel full of lunar earth so that if they had to turn around right now, they'd still have something. And that was called the contingency sample. So we got small samples from the contingency sample and from several of their other excursions. And our job was lunar geology. And we were doing non-destructive testing using Mossbauer spectroscopy. So had a long career in science, and I've been an entrepreneur. I did a silly thing you should never do. I opened a flying school in 1978, and I taught flying for about 3 years and sold Cessna aircraft. But I've got to be a better man than I gonna get in. The aviation business fell apart in 1981, and it didn't reconstitute for 20 years. But spent a lot of time working for NASA, DOD, commercial stuff. Opened a gasohol station back when alcohol fuels were brand new. But a lot of my life I've spent trying to save other people's lives. I was president of Mothers Against Drunk Driving in the early 1980s, Santa Barbara chapter, and worked on a lot of stuff to protect people from improvised explosive devices, find them before they went off. And I've got a project now to try to save 1,500 lives every year from gunshot injuries. And it sounds crazy, but this right here is the world's best protection weapon to use. It's a Buck Rogers ray gun, and all you have to do is set it for stun, like they did on the very first episode of Star Wars. And if you got some guy that's wreaking havoc in the streets, police officer comes up and stuns him, then he'll wake up in handcuffs in the back of the car, and he'll be mad as a hornet, but nobody got hurt. And unfortunately, they don't exist, because if our nervous systems were that fragile, we never would have outcompeted saber-toothed cats.
Right.
And there's 541 patents out there on non-lethal weapons, because when I filed for mine, I checked it, and there were 541 of them ahead of me. But really only the taser and the occasional beanbag gun are used, and they're not very effective because you have to know in advance that you're going to need to use them. And the typical police engagement, you have 3 seconds of warning, and it happens in nearly total dark at a range of 20 feet. And at that point, a police officer who's skilled misses 2/3 of the time. And, you don't get to pick. So if you don't have something that will stop someone without killing them, and that you don't have to think about, and it works just as well as the handgun they now have, a police officer will never use it. And then it goes into the Museum of Useless Ideas. But I spent about 9 years going to the Classified Warheads and Ballistics seminar every year at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. And I was not impressed, because if you talk about things like military weapons, they do really a stand-up job of designing very smart munitions. But I've personally never seen really smart munitions for civilian use. And when you think about it, that's absurd. And the reason it's absurd is that in a postmodern industrialized society like ours, if a police officer has to use a weapon, Within 2 minutes, there's an ambulance. Within 3 minutes, there's backup. And within 4 minutes, there's a news helicopter. So there's no actual point in having lethality involved with it. If you can stop someone and not kill them, that's what you should be doing. And it's inconceivable that that's not part of the conversation. So
Right.
I
Can you tell us a bit about like the stopping power as far as in regards to other non-lethal guns, such as like, you know, the beanbag guns or the rubber bullets or things of that nature?
Well, you know, the beanbag guns.
And rubber bullets are still technically lethal, are they not?
Well, you know,
you could still kill somebody with one of those.
Your job, should you choose to accept it, is to take someone out of the fight. That's your whole job, and that's your only job. And anything else that you do is either an unwanted side effect or downright wrong. And about just the numbers, about 1,000 people are killed by police officers every year from gunshots. And only about 20 of them are controversial. I know personally of a story where an officer who is a friend of mine was called into a domestic dispute. It turns out that the perpetrator that resulted in the dispute was a crazy, well-known drug dealer. He had just murdered his 2 children. They were lying at his feet in pools of blood. He had his wife hammerlocked with a gun to her head. You don't have a great deal of choice in a matter like that, and you don't have a great deal of time. And so this friend of mine, who was a law enforcement officer, discharged his weapon, and he was able to kill the suspect and save the life of the woman. And those are the vast majority of times. Police officers actually don't draw their guns very often. But the problem that we have is that airplanes, for example, are the safest mode of transportation in the world, with the exception of maybe elevators. And even one airline crash is too much. And if we have an airline crash, we get on that and we study it and we make recommendations. We make engineering changes. When I was a kid, airline crashes happened with disarming frequency. You couldn't go through a year. I'm 71 years old. When I was a kid, like 10 or 12 or 15 years old, you would hear of an airline crash 2 or 3 times a year with all people killed. And every time that happened, the world's aviation authorities got together and studied it to try to find out what can we do to fix it. And every year, the crashes came from new items because the old ones were fixed. And then at some point in the early 1980s, airline accidents just stopped happening. For all practical purposes, they almost no longer exist. And if you aren't a statistics animal like I am, and by the way, you're completely within your rights to be very normal human beings. I'm not. I'm a statistic.
Yeah.
My wife will tell you that. And if you watch that stuff, you just suddenly think, wow, when was the last time I remember an airplane crash in the United States? You know, and if you're good, you might remember it, but it just doesn't happen. And that's the same thing as as using firearm discharge. Instead of having 20 that are controversial every year, how about 0? How about no deaths at all? How about lots of people who wake up in the hospital as mad as a hornet, injured, but not dead? And that's we have a gentleman who was he was a singer in church and a risk-based accountant living in Houston, Texas. And he was shot by a woman who was a police officer working a double shift who walked into his apartment by accident. And there's controversy about what happened next. But the bottom line is he's dead and her life is over. That's a huge tragedy. We had the woman who was one of the stars of E.T. She was a television star. She was also really, really, really mentally disturbed, like Margot Kidder style, mentally disturbed. This is in Hollywood about 8 weeks ago, as of this telling. And for the best of reasons, her neighbors called 911. They didn't know who would respond. And they said, our neighbor is in danger of hurting herself. 2 police officers were dispatched to the scene. They got in and said, ma'am, We are going to do right by you. Please sit down. We're calling an intervention unit right now. They did. You could hear the sirens from the intervention unit. It was all good. They were taking care of her for unknown reasons because she was crazy. She got up and went into the kitchen, picked up a BB gun pistol that was made to look like a real pistol and aimed it at one of the officers. And of course, the officer fired his weapon and she died. She's dead. His life is over. You don't forget that stuff. I would not want any one of my 3 sons to be that officer. I feel very bad for that guy and his family. That can change you forever. What a tragedy.
Definitely.
Too bad she isn't lying in a hospital getting plastic surgery for a non-fatal wound. And so I began to look into it, and there are lots and lots of examples of police officers who have later been killed by someone who received a fatal wound, but that was not instantly disabling. Notoriously, 1986, you can Google this. It's called the 1986 FBI Miami Shootout. There's an entire Wikipedia page on it. There were two crazy guys. One of them was an ex-Green Beret, one of them was an ex-Marine. They killed their wives. Then they went on a 2-week-long robbery spree where they were robbing 7-Elevens and liquor stores. They crossed state lines from Georgia into Florida, and that made it an FBI case. And they had killed numbers of people. The FBI received an intelligence tip that these guys were in a certain place in Miami. So they dispatched 14 agents in 7 cars, gave chase, and the 2 perpetrators crashed their vehicle into a tree, and the lead FBI vehicle tail-ended them because they couldn't stop. An FBI agent in car number 2 got out and was immediately seriously or fatally shot by one of the 2 perpetrators in the car. The agents in the front fired at those 2 perpetrators, and they hit one of them with a bullet that penetrated his chest, went through his lung, and went into his heart. It would ultimately be fatal because of internal bleeding, but it was not disabling. They thought it was. The agent who shot him thought that he'd been taken out of the action and then went back to aid his colleague who was lying bleeding on the ground. The perpetrator who was shot then went around and fired and hit both of the 2 lead agents in the head, killing both of them. It ultimately took 12 rounds before the perpetrator was shot, and there were 4 FBI dead. Now, the FBI's takeaway from that was, we need more powerful ammunition. So instead of the .357 service revolver that they used at the time, they went to a .40 caliber. What they found was that the loads on the .40 caliber were so high that the FBI were getting wrist injuries from repeated trauma from firing around that powerful in practice. So they had to reduce the amount of powder in the .40 caliber round, which ultimately gave it about the same stopping power, the same kinetic energy as the .357. But that, I think, is a terrible misreading, because the sources of fatality are either serious damage to a vital organ, or to a major bone structure, or to a blood vessel, or to a major nerve bundle. And in most cases, a bullet will penetrate without necessarily hitting one of those. And it turns out that the stopping power of a 22 caliber long rifle is the same as the stopping power of a .44 Magnum, despite the fact that the .44 Magnum has 10 times the kinetic energy of the 22 long rifle. Clearly, stopping power isn't necessarily related to fatality or to lethality. Right. So the big question is, how can you stop somebody? And the theory that I'm going on this is extraordinary amounts of surface pain. Most of the nerve endings are on the human body are in the skin. And if you want an exercise in that, take off all your clothes, jump on a motorcycle, drive at 65 miles an hour, stark naked, and now jump off and see how much that hurts and how and how much you feel like continuing a fight with a giant bleeding pavement rash. Of course you won't. So even though it sounds cruel, what I've designed is a round that will work in pistols. The intention is for it to go from 38, 357, 44, and 40 caliber. Excuse me, 45 and 40 caliber. 44 is not used very often by police agencies. It's intended for sonic and very slightly subsonic and very slightly supersonic ammunition. And it's intended for police and for people who keep firearms for self-protection at home. Because about 500, mostly children, die every year from firearms that were kept intentionally for home protection, but that were accidentally introduced into the hands of a child. Now, will criminals use these?
Yeah, especially important for them. Making sure that, if it does get in the hands of a child, like parents who own firearms and have children, that I think that would be key for them. It'd be like the responsible choice.
Right. And we've had some discussions on these topics and podcasts before this too, so this is pretty cool to get to talk about it with an expert.
Yeah, and because like it's one thing, like sure, like for the common civilian, they'd still like have their choice of what bullet they use, but for the so for the people who don't have children, maybe they still use the same bullets. But I mean, if you just need it for protection, then why not have the non-lethal bullets? And especially if you have children around who may accidentally get a hold of it.
Yeah, I mean, I try to keep coming up with analogies because I'm trying to go for a new way of thinking. And it's rough. When I was with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, my brother was killed by a drunk driver in 1981 in Orange County, California. I think about it every day. And at the time, there were 50,000 deaths a year on the road in the United States. Half of them were killed as a result of drunk driving crashes. And the terminology that we used was they're not accidents, they're crashes. And the idea that you would have a drunk driving crash at the time was more or less thought of as, oh, well, accidents happen. There's no such mentality right now. My stepson is a bartender. He manages people to get calls with Uber and telephone friends and sober, the non-drinking person in the party all the time. It's an accepted part of the culture, and it took a very long time. And the notion that you would simply get drunk, get in a car, drive, and think everything was okay is just not part of the culture in 2018, nor should it be. And what I would like to do is get an actual idea that a lethal bullet kept for self-protection is just so 20th century. We can do much, much better than that. Instead of having smart rounds, those would be dumb rounds. In every measure I know of acceptability, smart better than dumb, because and so there were 541 others, and the two things facing a police officer are the typical police officer. By the way, there's 1 million uniformed officers in the United States. The majority will never unholster a weapon in their entire career. And the number of times when a police officer shoots is actually very small. There's a fascinating book called On Killing that was authored by, I'll think of his name. He was the chief psychologist for the United States Army. He worked at West Point. He did a survey going back to Roman legionnaires, to the Franco-Prussian War, to the American Civil War, the battles of World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and took a look at not only the choice to fire, but also the after effects of firing. And what he found is that the majority of people don't like to do this. In the Civil War, on battlefields, what they found was that only about 10% of soldiers under fire discharged a weapon in defense. They simply didn't have it within themselves to kill their fellow humans. The same thing actually happened in World War II. A very, very, very small number of people were responsible for pulling almost all the triggers. Interestingly enough, on both sides of the conflict. Same thing in World War I. And obviously, there are a lot of what are referred to as crew-fired weapons, where the personal experience of targeting another human being is a couple of steps away because it's sort of a video game, like as in, you know, a JDAM or something like that being dropped from, you know, an aircraft or something. But people don't like to do it. And police officers statistically exercise tremendous amounts of restraint. I'm a statistics guy. I read the numbers all the time. And even in the case of weapons held for self-protection, people trick themselves into thinking that their personal security system is so good that a child would never get hold of a weapon, or if they did, that the child had been trained. But that's simply statistically not there. Killed. So, yeah. So, I designed a smart bullet. Imagine, if you will, that this is a 357. If you shrank it down by a factor of 10, it would be 9 millimeters wide, 16 millimeters tall. And it's designed intelligently. It has what the weapons community refers to as submunitions. And these submunitions would be, in the real item, made out of tungsten. Tungsten is the heaviest substance you're likely to encounter. There's a few heavier, like osmium, but it's 40% denser than lead. It's non-toxic. There's tungsten compounds that are consumed and you can eat. It is both tough, meaning it won't bend, and it's hard, meaning it won't break. And it can easily be seen on x-rays for removal. And the tungsten submunitions are carried on a small carrier. And then there is a 3-part component in the front. I've made these out of plastic on a 3D printer. This is called a spreader, which spreads the tungsten submunitions out. This is a ballistic penetrator, and the ballistic penetrator is what makes contact with the target. And then inside, there's a piece that would be made out of a material called spinel. Spinel looks like glass, and it feels like glass, and it's transparent, but it has short-range atomic ordering, meaning that it's a form of crystal. And there's a lot of different spinels. They have the advantage that they shatter at about 350,000 psi, which is roughly the same as the hardest rocks on Earth. And in actual, and of course there's a jacket that doesn't have any mechanical significance because it's thin and it just holds them together. If it hits a person, the softness of the human body makes this into about a 50,000 G stop. And when it happens, the spreader pushes the tungsten submunitions out, and they cause massive bleeding skin damage about the size of a pizza. Again, imagine getting pavement rash falling off a motorcycle at 65 miles an hour. And I will have to say, yes, had the experience, no, not repeating it. Now, other that are police officers,
you know firsthand that will leave someone incapacitated.
You know what? Don't pop a rear tire on a motorcycle when you're laid over at 30 degrees going around a 65 mile an hour corner. That's all I have to say. It's going on the Ward Memorial Boulevard going to UCSB, and I remember it every time I drive to UCSB, and it was 40 years ago. So the problem is, if a police officer sometimes has to shoot a suspect through a window of a car, when that police officer is threatened with being killed by someone using a vehicle to kill them, to crash into them, it happens a lot. It's very sad when it happens. But in that case, that bullet has to go through the window. And if it's shattered like that, it's not going through the window. Now, if it hits glass, this bullet undergoes a 350,000 G stop. The numbers when you're at those speeds and with these small geometries are just remarkable. I, of course, don't have a piece of spinel to shatter. I have a spring in here to simulate it. But if it hits an automotive windshield, instead of spreading, the spinel piece will shatter, meaning that the ballistic penetrator covers the submunitions and they don't separate and they go through the windshield. So that's the smart part. What I had to do was design a bullet that will shatter if it hits something soft and won't shatter if it hits something hard, which is the reverse of how things normally work. And if you follow the science, the physics field of fluids, it's of rheology. This is called a non-Newtonian behavior. So I had to design smart non-Newtonian behavior ammunition. And it's the only one in the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So
I really love the detection ability too, of being able to sense by the pressure if it's gonna hit, like whether if it's gonna hit skin or a window. That's really impressive.
Thank you. And I worked on it for a long time. And you know, like I say, after I was in counterterrorism for 5.5 years, and it was counter improvised explosive devices. But you know, I was working in ballistics all the time, high-speed ballistics, and and by the way, I'm not sure this would work on a rifle. I think it wouldn't because of the extremely high speeds. The time constants that you have to be working with are tens to hundreds of microseconds, and if you have 3,000 foot per second ballistics, it's individually right around a microsecond to 15 or 20 microseconds. That's probably a little too fast for geometries like this, but it doesn't have to, because the majority of the time it's a pistol. And, you know, again, these are not for hunting. These are not for, I mean, basically you don't even have to use them for target practice. And my intention is to make them shoot and feel to the shooter exactly like a current round, to fly exactly like a current round. They would have mass, angular, moment of inertia, aerodynamics, exactly the same as a conventional bullet. You shouldn't know that you're firing. You should think that you're firing a regular one and have someone go down. And you know, I was just reading. There's an Article 32 hearing going on right now involving some U.S. SEAL special forces. It's going on regard to an ISIS fighter who was 15 years old, who was shot multiple times. The ISIS fighter remained in the fight and was able to return fire. And they were the ones that ultimately killed him by loss of blood were to his lower leg and upper leg. But even in a case like that, those are 3,000 foot per second ammunition, and absorbing several of them wasn't necessarily lethal. He stayed in the fight, and he was opposing Afghan regular forces and U.S. military forces. I'm going for take the guy out of the fight, and this will not be accepted by police unless it does that better than existing ammunition. And the design effort is to make it do that better. So we're really trying to save lives. There's 1,500 people a year who shouldn't be dead. Maybe some of them are really bad guys, but that's okay. Really bad guys shouldn't be dead either. We are a civil society, and we're a postmodern industrial society. We don't live in the times of tribes and warriors and castles and onagers and sieges around castles. We live in a time of the internet and miracle drugs and wonderful surgeries and the internet and Twitter and all sorts of things. And we shouldn't be having people dying. It's just,
right. And even of the people who may have the argument, like say, okay, yeah, some of those are bad people that are getting killed. Well, also some of them aren't. Some of them, you know, mishappenings do happen, you know, like
they do.
And on top of that, being able to change the culture to a way of, all right, yeah, you know, you could pick your regular bullets, or you could have these, like I said, in cases where you need it for your security, but you have children around the house, you know. because you never know what those, like, no one expects their 6-year-old kid to get a hold of their gun, you know, like no one expects those kind of cases. So why not have, you know, the bullet works the same for protection, and if that case does happen, then okay, now we don't have a dead child needlessly.
Yeah, I mean, I taught flying for 8 years. Every time I teach somebody in retractable gear, there was always on the gear lever, there's a detent. You have to push this little button to lower the gear. You have to know you're lowering the gear and know it isn't the flap lever, you know, and if you put the gear down at too high a speed, you're going to blow the doors off. So you won't have any gear doors, and you might end up hurting the vertical or horizontal stabilizer if that happens. Could be, I mean, bottom line is you want to know it's the gear. There's all sorts of things like that. Much of my life, I worked either, you know, in aviation or underwater or in explosives, where you only get a chance to make the same mistake once. And if you only make the same mistake once, you make doggone sure that what you want to happen happens, and that when you don't want it to happen, it doesn't happen. Sounds like Dr. Seuss. So anyway, that's what we're trying to do. And we have an Indiegogo fundraise, and I'm sporting a T-shirt right here that says "Stop Not Kill," and
yeah, love it.
$25, you get a T-shirt, and you help save a life. We call it Stop Not Kill, SNK, stopnotkill.com. And where we are at is, you know, I worked on the Apollo when I was a little tiny, well, not when I was a little tiny kid. When I was in high school, I worked on the Apollo summers. And I worked on the Apollo while I was in college. And doggone it, we didn't put a man on the moon, but we did. And then I worked on the moon rocks when I came back. Research and development doesn't happen overnight. This is a research and development effort. And contributors to our Indiegogo campaign will get to do real science. First thing that's going to happen is I'm going to do extraordinary amounts of computational simulation. There's very, very good software out to do this. So in the computer, I will create analog human bodies with multiple types of clothing and in multiple angles and in multiple distances, as well as non-human things like buildings and automotive structures and plants, trees, and things like that to study the effects of ricochet. And I've got a lot of 3-degree angles here, and they might have to be 3.5-degree angles. So we'll be changing it a little bit, probably. That's what real R&D is about. And then we're going to start building them, and we're going to start test firing them in a laboratory. And our contributors get to go with us, and we're video this, and we're going to put it up on this very site. And so you get to be one of our co-scientists if you are one of our contributors. It'll be just like Mythbusters, except you'll be part of the action. And that is how real science is done, because, you know, I've been doing that for a long, like I used to tell people in the IT business, making antimatter was the funnest thing I ever did for the first 3 days. And after that, it was as boring as hell. And but that is the way science goes. Try to keep it fascinating. We're going to have different targets every time. And at the end of the day, we are going to save a bunch of lives. And my feeling is, what time is it, folks? It's time to save a life.
Time to save a life. I love it. I will thank you so much for coming on, Wayne. I
can't thank you guys enough. I really can't. I mean, I'm the geeky scientist. I mean, look at you guys. You're college educated, insurance experts. You do video production. You have a rap group. I mean, come on, man. And you know, you're part of that culture. I'm kind of like Sheldon on The Big Bang Theory, which is way out, you know, so far out, maybe you're backing in on the other side. But yeah, you know, I'm delighted. Thank you so much. Love that smile.
This was fun.
Yeah, it was great having you, man. And yeah, we gotta connect with, you know, all the science geeks and nerds and everyone who wants to just be a part of saving lives. Because how cool is that?
Well, you can shoot things really fast and save a life. Come on, every young guy wants to do that, right?
Right.
My boys do, my grandkids do, you know. save a life and have some fun.
Yeah, gun lovers and gun control alike. Like,
Oh yeah,
I mean,
who cares?
everyone wins in this.
My position on the Second Amendment. I kind of almost don't care how you feel. This is just a matter of having, it's making sure that the handle on the ejection seat has a lock. Man, you do not want to pull the ejection seat lever and go through the canopy unless you intended to. I mean, I met a guy who did, and the canopy didn't come off, and he's got a scar all the way up and down his arm. Not fun. So, that's all it is.
All right. Well, thank you very much again, Mr. Wayne Norris. This has been episode 33 of Figure It Out.
33. I love it. Thank you. Have a wonderful time, you guys.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on.
Appreciate it.